This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Poet Arthur Sze describes diving into the world of poetry as a leap into the unknown. He was studying at MIT when he was first bit by the poetry bug, and it sent him on a life-changing trajectory. Even as a poet, his path was always a bit non-traditional. He spent his career translating classical Chinese poetry. He's taught incarcerated juvenile offenders at New Mexico School for the Deaf. And today, he is the 25th United States Poet Laureate, a job to promote the power of poetry, and maybe get you to read a little bit of it too. Arthur Sze joins us today for a conversation on poetry, the power of language, and bridging worlds through the art of translation. Arthur, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I love your origin story when it comes to your path onto poetry, because your first poem came to you while you were sitting in a classroom at MIT as a freshman. Not the place that you normally think where poetry comes to a person, but so curious to hear, how did those poetic words first appear to you?
Yeah, I'm going to back up a little bit, and because I think it'll be of interest to listeners. As a Chinese American, I was born in Manhattan, grew up in Fresh Meadows, Queens, and then on Long Island. And I grew up with a lot of pressure, like many Asian Americans, to do something safe and professional. And it was not what are you going to do? It's like, are you going to be a scientist or an engineer, basically. My father got his PhD in chemical engineering from MIT. And in high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was good at math and science, so I applied to MIT. I was accepted, and my family was thrilled and thought I would follow in my father's footsteps. But oftentimes, life is about the ruptures of expected plot or plot lines. So I, as you say, got to MIT in my very first semester. I sat in a large calculus lecture hall. The professor had like 9 whiteboards. He was writing equations. And somehow I always think that I think of Thoreau saying most men lead lives of quiet desperation. I couldn't have articulated it then, but I felt really uncomfortable in that lecture hall. I knew I could do the mathematics, and I just flipped to the back of my notebook and I started to write. And so that was a revelation to me. And then the next day, I wrote some more and I wrote some more. And pretty soon I was writing all the time. And I knew that's what I really wanted to do. So I feel like poetry came to me late. There were probably seeds that were planted earlier. But in some ways, being in such an intense math and science environment made me quickly think about, is this what I want to do with my life? And I discovered that no, that I really wanted to pursue working creatively with language. And poetry is the most intense and musical form of language, immediately inspired me.
Well, because you used the word ruptured, and I wonder if you were surprised that the revelation came to you at that point, because it was uncomfortable. And I'm kind of picturing ruptures happen when things built up and it finally explodes. And when that explosion happened to you, metaphorically in a classroom, were you excited about it? Were you afraid of it? Or was it a mix of various emotions?
I was actually very excited and thrilled by it. I mean, and frankly, when it first happened, I had no idea what was going on, but I was just excited to be working with language. I remember that evening in my dorm room looking at the phrases I'd written and composing my first poem. And then it could have passed, right? It could have just been, oh, well, that was a one-time thing and back to, the sort of career path. But instead, a few days later, I was writing and writing and writing. And I knew instinctively on a very deep level that this is what I wanted to do. It was only scary in the sense that this was all new to me, but I never had doubts like, oh, like trying to second guess myself, saying, oh, is this, something that's just a mere incident and I should let it go. I knew very quickly that I was tapping into a deeper part of myself. And yeah, I knew, I think within a few months that this is what I wanted to do with my life.
And we've had a lot of conversations on the show before about the connectiveness of arts and sciences and how both, I think to me, are really led by a sense of curiosity. And while you did not have a career in science, but you did kind of straddle the both worlds. And I do hear a lot from a lot of people who do that in the sense of our delineation of science and art, that the two things are really a lot more connected than we think. And I think we're still sort of in the process of sort of blending the two together. How does that sense of curiosity from both senses of the areas art and science come into play for you?
Well, first, I agree that art and science are not as antithetical or in as much tension as many people believe, because there is that sense of curiosity, a sense of wonder. The really good physicists I know have a very humble recognition that there's such a small speck or part of the cosmos. And so I think in the beginning you might think, oh, mathematics, science has such a different sort of language to it that it's maybe in tension or even opposition with art. And I'm personalizing it a little bit and saying that when I left MIT and transferred to UC Berkeley, and we'll get into this in a little bit, I turned to classical Chinese poetry. I turned to nature as my source. And I thought, oh, I'm turning my back on science. I don't really need that as a poet. But actually, a few years later on, I began to think, no, I really do need that science background, that there are structures there, there are ways of looking at the world that are really valuable. And why not incorporate the unpoetic or even anti-poetic into poetry? So scientific vocabulary, scientific structures, terms, things that I thought initially, in the first few months would not be of value to me, turned out to be extremely valuable in the long run. And the other thing I'll add is when I came to Santa Fe, New Mexico, I happened to become friends with a number of renowned physicists who are working at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And one of them was Murray Gell-Mann, the Nobel laureate who discovered the quark particle. And actually, the other physicist, George Zweig, who also simultaneously and independently discovered that subatomic particle. They both became good friends of mine in the 1980s here in Santa Fe. And I had amazing conversations that were about discovery and wonder and sort of the cosmos that were very influential and helpful for me as a poet. So in the end, I might have thought, oh, I'm leaving science behind, but then in the long run, it's really become integral to how I work as a poet.
Well, and then before we get into more of that, do you remember what were the phrases or words that came to you and became a poem when you were sitting in that classroom?
You mean in the very first poem that I wrote?
Yes.
I don't, but I do know that that evening in my dorm room, I looked at those phrases and I thought they were inspired by a memory of looking at a painting by Modigliani. So I was sort of like in a dream kind of consciousness in the lecture hall, just writing phrases. But I was really imagining looking at a painting.
Well, and you just spoke about how you sort of went to the classical Chinese poems as sounds like the poems and the poets from that era were sort of your mentors or poets that guided you into your first initial education into poetry. What was it about that era or the way ancient Chinese poetry is set up that drew you in?
So I transferred from MIT to UC Berkeley. And when I started out as a junior at Berkeley, I read some translations of Chinese poetry in English, and I felt very dissatisfied with them. The speakers sounded like they lived 100 years ago. The use of language seemed really odd and stiff. And as I looked a little more, I thought, oh, there are scholars of Chinese poetry who will know the Chinese text better than I ever will, but they're not really poets. The language isn't fresh and alive. And I thought, as a young poet, I should take some of these poems that I knew through family and culture and was learning in language classes at UC Berkeley. And I thought I should try and translate them into English. And again, it was not a big plan. I started with a poem by Li Bai and a poem by Zhang Ji. And I remember struggling with translating them. And I went up to a TA who was teaching a conversational Mandarin class, and I asked him at the end if he could go over my translations. I wanted to make sure I was doing a good job. And he just totally lit up and said, I love these poems. I'll meet with you outside of class. And I started on a whole education that was never part of a class where I translated 25 Tang Dynasty poems, character by character. And for me, the purpose was twofold. I wanted to try and create poems out of these translations, that translations that had a vigorous and a voice that was alive, a shape of language that was contemporary. And then, unforeseen to me, as I started to do that, I discovered I can learn so much as a poet for my own poetry doing this. So then it just kept feeding me over time.
I feel like most big plans start off as little plans or plans that you didn't expect to happen, as you say, very unseen. And because translating in general is such a challenging endeavor, I have so much respect for anyone who does any form of translation because you have to consider so much. It's not just the words, it's the stories behind it, it's the history and the nuance and the context. Why do you think the art of translation has captivated you so much?
There are so many reasons. So when I started to translate, I found that if I just read the Chinese characters on the page, I was outside of the poem. So I had to write out by hand, using my own body, each character stroke by stroke. And then I started to discover I was personalizing the language. I was slowing down. I wasn't just reading on the surface. I was slowing down and deepening the process of reading. And I like to say that I discovered translation is the deepest form of reading because instead of reading 20 characters and saying, I've got it, I would be writing out stroke by stroke each character, thinking about how did the poet choose this character and why the next one and why the next one and what is going on inside of the poem. And so for me, that became a thrilling process of discovery, and it helped me enlarge the possibilities of my own poetry.
Do you think you were using your brain in a different way, or was it sort of? I don't want to separate your poet brain versus your science brain, but it feels like there's a complementary process between the two as you're translating.
Yeah, I think. I was thrilled writing that first poem. I was thrilled translating. So I suppose I was prioritizing that side of my brain in doing that. Yeah.
Arthur Sze is the 25th U.S. Poet Laureate, and he'll stay with us for this hour. Let us know if you want to hear more conversations about books and authors. Sign up for our Where We Read newsletter. It has a monthly rundown of what the Where We Read or Where We Live team is reading, and also includes highlights of some of the best author interviews on Connecticut Public. Listen back and find your next read at Connecticut Public or at ctpublic.org/where we read. I'm Catherine Shen. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking to Arthur Sze. He's the 25th U.S. Poet Laureate. Arthur is traveling the country with his signature project, Words Bridging Worlds, a series of workshops and readings that celebrate poetry in translation. So, Arthur, we talked a lot about sort of the art of translation and sort of your philosophy behind it. And you mentioned too that there's a musicality to poetry that you really love. So, how do you keep that alive when you're translating a piece of poetry? Is saying the poem out loud of your translation part of the process? Noticing the rhythm or the sound. What's that like for you?
Thank you. What a great question. I always think of the Italian phrase "traduttore traditore," which means translator, trader. And so a translator is always having to face the sense of loss from one language to another, and how to be faithful to the experience of the poem from one language to another, and how to convey that. There's so many ways. And with my book, Transient Worlds, instead of providing like a poem in Chinese and a translation in English, I provide multiple translations to show how different translators do it. And yes, the sound is and rhythm are crucial, and you need to feel them in your body. So I really start by reading the poem aloud, as I said, writing out the characters, but listening to the music. And Chinese, of course, is a tonal language, and you can't carry those tones over into English. Traditional classical poems are chanted, so the tonalities are even, particularly vowel sounds, even stronger. But in this segment, I'd like to put in some examples. So if I may, I'd like to read a translation. This is a poem by Tao Yuanming, who lived from 365 to 427 Common Era. So for a translator, it's like, oh my God, I'm taking a poem from over 1,000 years ago from a very different language. How do I convey this in English? And obviously the sounds are different, the rhythm is different. But what I tried to do here in my translation, which is only one of many, of course, is to carry that spirit and that musicality in English. So here it is, Drinking Wine. I built my house near where others live, and yet without noise of horse or carriage. You ask, how can this be? A distant mind leaves the earth around it. I pick chrysanthemums below the eastern fence, then gaze at mountains to the south. The mountain air is fine at sunset. Flying birds go back in flocks. In this, there is a truth I wish to tell you, but lose the words. I tried to use a kind of lyricism in English, and the Chinese text has its own lyricism, and I had to, for English, insert pronouns, the I, a speaker, and Chinese doesn't do that. It's very rare for an I to appear in a poem. And so in English, as a translator, I'm having to make strategic decisions. And I wanted to put that personalization. So I built my house. I picked chrysanthemums. I wish to tell you, but lose the words. I wanted to keep the language simple and fluid and lyrical.
Well, and as you shared how you sort of personalized the experience, and along the way, especially in the past, I think a lot can be lost in translation, because translation ultimately is a pretty subjective art. It can bring conflict, but also inspire togetherness, but also depends on where the translator's from, right? Could you describe the broader impacts of translation? Like, what can they have on us even beyond poetry?
Well, translation is huge. It builds bridges. It helps us understand other cultures. Literary translation can take texts that are really ancient and make them contemporary. It can take the foreign and unintelligible and make them accessible. And ultimately, it unites us all, because a really good poem shows us that the emotional, imaginative, the intellectual interiors of our lives, no matter what language we're writing in, are universal. And even as non-literary translation, we need translation to communicate. We live in a world with so many languages I visited as Poet Laureate Queens College in New York City. And to my surprise, the president said to me, over 80 languages are spoken by students on campus alone, which really stunned me and excited me that there are so many worlds of languages coexisting. And so translation really is crucial in helping us understand each other, in communicating, in appreciating our cultural backgrounds. And as literary translation, we have the chance to take texts from 1,000 years ago, like the Tao Chen, and bring them alive today. So it's got a huge role to play, and I am particularly excited as poet laureate to assemble this book, Transient Worlds, that includes 23 poems from 13 different languages. And my goal is to use translation as a way to widen and also deepen the appreciation of poetry across the country.
As you were sharing, I was just reminded that every time someone asks me the question, what superpower do you want to have? And it's usually flying or be invisible. And I'm like, I would love to speak every single language on this planet, because can you imagine not having to ever experience getting lost in translation?
Right. And that's an amazing sort of dream and task. And just with my limited experience with this book, to choose 13 languages is sort of like which ones. And because I worked with Native American students for 22 years in Santa Fe, I picked a poem by a former student that's in Navajo in the Dene language. And I have no idea how to say that. There are glottal stops to the language. And he created a visual poem. And so that's also translatable. And have a Mayan dialect, Tseltal, that's in the book, but to have Arabic, Hebrew, Chinese, Japanese, French, Spanish, German, Brash, Basa, Danish. What a fantastic thing to start thinking of these languages. So I applaud your idea of, wouldn't it be great to be able to
Wouldn't that be great? I'll just
or say one word in every language would be amazing.
Right? I'll just keep dreaming, and hopefully someone who's sitting in an MIT classroom can figure out a device to allow us to do that at some point. We'll love that. And sort of with that in mind, this idea of you doing this project, why the 13, and what was that process like? And did you learn something new about yourself as you were doing this?
Well, I learned so much about doing it. And why 13? I wanted the book to be a pocket size and to fit in a jacket and be easily portable. I wanted it to have enough extension and variety where a reader could just go to a language they know or that interested them. And I didn't want the book to be overwhelming. So I didn't, to have like poems from, say, twice the size, 25, 26 languages would be too big. The other thing is I had this amazingly challenging task of trying to bring this book out within the year in which I was appointed to when it was published. I had literally 90 days to assemble the entire book. And it's a lifetime of learning, of working as a poet and translator that went into this. So I started by immediately picking poems from languages I loved. There's a poem in Spanish by Pablo Neruda, Solo la Muerte, and I have two different translations, one by Robert Bly, one by Donald Walsh. So one of the things I'm doing is juxtaposing different versions in English and then discussing them, making it a creative source book. And with the Tao Chen poem, I actually invite the reader to make their own translation. I provide a crib of the Chinese, and I've got 3 different translations. So I really started the book building it around the poems I loved from many different languages. Sappho 31 from ancient Greek. I don't read Greek, but I love that poem. And there are 4 different translations by Guy Davenport, Ann Carson, Mary Barnard, and Jim Powell. And I talk about how each translator finds something of value. And so as I grew the book around poems that I really loved, there's the great Rilke poem, Archaic Torso of Apollo, where it ends, "You must change your life And it's a stunning poem where Apollo enters this sculpture, and the viewers who come into a museum think they're looking at an object, and it's reversed, where the object is alive and animated, telling the viewer, you must change your life. It's kind of like when I thought about that poem, I thought that's the ending to the book. And then I didn't want the book to be like a novel or an essay where chapter 7 depends on chapters 1 through 6. So the structure of Transient Worlds is nonlinear. And I call them zones. So if you like French, you can go to a poem by Apollinaire and start right there. If you like German, you could start with a Rilke. If you like Chinese, you could look at the Tao Chen. So they're all independent but mutually interpollinating zones about translation, creativity, and language.
You know, as you're describing the different languages and the countries and the culture, I'm so curious, and I'm wondering here in terms of there's a universality of, and when we talk about poetry, I think it's very similar to, we often use food as a way to transcend through barriers of culture and country. Do you think poetry does the same? And why do you think poetry can do the same?
I do think it does the same. I think of well, once you start writing, you approach poetry differently. And I want to say that in junior high school, I had a terrible experience with poetry where it was taught to be difficult, esoteric. And when I started to write poetry, again, it was like looking at language from the inside out. I would read poems and then think, how are they constructed and how did they become alive? And the reading became like a source of food. So I felt like I wasn't just reading, but I wasn't analyzing. I was literally organically digesting and feeding myself, thinking about, oh, I love these poems. How can they feed me? How can I draw nourishment and sustenance out of that? And I think then creating poems when feels the same. So when is reading poems from different languages, it's a kind of emotional, imaginative, spiritual source of nourishment. We know that, historically, in very difficult times, poetry has played a vital role to play. I think in the Second World War, I believe in Poland, certain phrases of poems were used as passwords to be able to enter to find people to sort of work together. And in ancient China, a poet has been executed for writing a particular poem. Poetry is taken really seriously, like this is language at its most powerful. So that sense of spiritual nourishment, I think, is clearly there.
And as from the moment you realized this was going to be your path, it's both something that nourishes you and also something that you can work on professionally. Have you found yourself discovering new emotions during the journey, or maybe parts of yourself that you didn't expect to go deeper on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think growing as a poet, maturing as a poet means maturing as a whole person. And it's not so much as like discovering a particular emotion, but finding nuances and depths and ways of expression that can amplify. Again, I sort of want to tie it to a poem, if that's okay.
Go for it.
And I'm going to, recently, I started to write a series of poems in the voice of different creatures. And this particular poem is called Jaguar Song. And obviously, it has anger to it. I was thinking about what would a jaguar say to the kind of developments that are happening that endanger their environments. So here it is. It's one run-on sentence. Jaguar Song. And it does have that deepening and articulation of emotion. Jaguar Song. Just after you sign and envision building homes on this tract, you smell me in the dark. Know that I move through this terrain at night, though you only think of building and selling. Even now you believe you can borrow my spirit by wearing a mask of my face on your face. Look at me. Delve into your fears. Is your deepest fear to be hacked strangled, or be strapped to an IV in a bed with no chance to die. I can grasp a turtle and break its shell with one bite. I can pounce on a deer and crush its skull and neck with my teeth. You slash and burn in the jungle, force the snakes and macaws to retreat. You even burn your own species alive. Look into my eyes. I am your mirror and transformer. If you destroy my species, I will shapeshift and hunt you in your dreams. The fingerprints of your hands resemble the black rosettes on my skin, and you will not escape. You will never comprehend the twin nights in my eyes. Remember, as a child, you came up the steps from the basement and flicking off the light at the top of the stairs, feared a hand about to grasp your shoulder from behind. That fear is alive. And now, as you rummage for keys at your apartment doorstep, I am a passing jogger about to pounce. I am the creature who smells your darkest thoughts. And as you turn the key in the lock day or night, out of the darkness, I spring.
I think your description of the eyes, calling them twin lights, is one of my favorite lines from that poem, actually. And so thanks for reading that one. Why the jaguar?
The jaguar, because it's such a potent creature in the American Southwest, and it's endangered environment. Its habitat is shrinking. And so the trigger was actually reading about how these developers were building this huge complex of buildings, and they had no idea that it was part of a jaguar pathway, basically. So they were totally destroying not just the habitat, but the way that jaguars move through a particular terrain. They were like building a freeway across their road. It was like a stunner when they discovered that. And I thought, for me, the jaguar is really powerful. And I'll personalize it back to a story from science. So we're interconnecting everything. I was good friends with Murray Gell-Mann, the physicist, and he was working on a book on complexity. And one day he called me and he said, Arthur, you have a phrase, the quark and the jaguar. And Murray laughed and he said, I picked the term quark out of a novel by James Joyce for the subatomic particle, and that's simplicity. But the jaguar is complex, it's alive, it's powerful. Can I use the phrase the quark and the jaguar as the title to my book on complexity? And I thought, sure, I'd be honored to do that. And so the jaguar also, over time, for me, has had this sense of mysterious power of a creature who has a kind of raw energy. And to come back to your question about emotions, I mean, you could say, oh, yeah, well, as a writer, as a poet, you learn to tap into your fear or you deepen your fear. But I think it's not like discovering a new emotion, it's discovering the depth, the complexity, the power, and the sort of shape behind different emotions. And as one moves through life, of course, that happens with love and death and anger, joy, all the emotions that are there. But writing with language gives them particular shapes and then allows an enactment of that experience. So hopefully it isn't like, oh, well, the Jaguar song is about fear, but there's an enactment through the voice of the Jaguar that's surprising.
Well, and I think it's also a great example as to what poetry can do. And I think sometimes poetry can be really intimidating because you might go in thinking like, oh, I'm not going to be able to understand this if I don't know the nuance or I don't understand this line. But Jaguar Song, as an example, there's a clear idea of what's going on here. And poetry, as we know, I think it can be used for information, education, and all of that. And on top of that, translation, going back to translations, can also expand access, giving us access to words and works that we might not ever be able to read. But this is a process that, of course, takes time. Do you think there is a need for more poets, more writers to be engaged in this type of work?
I do, and it's collective work. It's writers, it's readers. Yeah, where do I start? I think I want to start by saying, we live in such a fast-paced world. We're constantly moving with all sorts of information, and you cannot speed read a poem. If you do, you're cheating yourself. What you want to do is read a poem aloud for the sound and the rhythm and to feel it in your body. And I think, in my experience, some of the best poems are ones I don't understand immediately, but I feel that there's something intuitively happening with the language that interests me. Sometimes there are poems I read and I think, wow, that's really great. But after I've read them 10 times, it's sort of like, okay, I got it. And then there are other poems I read that grow on me. And it's not like I understand them immediately, but over time they emerge and they become intelligible. And I can't resist quoting Wallace Stevens, Hartford, Connecticut, right? Wallace Stevens once wrote, "Poetry must resist the intelligence almost successfully." And I love that because it's not like a poem is intelligible on a first reading, but a poem communicates in your body before you fully understand it, before you can intellectually articulate it. And as you read it and feel that sound and rhythm and trust it, you learn to trust a movement of language that is deep, that helps us pay attention and notice things, that is in contrast to our fast moving, superficial world. And ultimately, the poem does need to be intelligible. And that's why Stephen says almost successfully. But it's a process. You read poems, you get hooked on them, you start to engage with them, they deepen, and then maybe, hopefully, a handful of poems become important to your life. And even if it's one poem, I notice with my nephews who aren't necessarily literary readers, when they got married, they all felt the need to have a poem read at their wedding. And that interested me, that poetry still has this sense of, in particular moments, turning points of one's life, people who may not be literary still turn to poetry and find it meaningful and important. And I guess as poet laureate, my task is, or my hope is, to try and expand that, to say those moments can happen at a wedding, but they can happen when you wake up and open the curtain and look outside and the first light comes in, or it could happen in the evening before you close your eyes, that these moments are all there, they're magical. And so poetry has a vital role to play in making us, in connecting us and deepening our awareness.
Well, my brain just went through a serious series of cranial plate shifts as you were going through all of that, because I think you answered every single question before I even asked it. So thanks for that. We do have to go to break, but we will come back with more questions about what we were just talking about. We're here with Arthur Sze, who is the 25th U.S. Poet Laureate. I'm Catherine Shen. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. And we're back with Arthur Sze, who is our U.S. Poet Laureate. And I want to jump straight back to a question about your Santa Fe's first Poet Laureate as well. And it was because of a friend's suggestion that you ended up in New Mexico in the first place. So as somebody who has moved to places where I didn't know anybody, I'm so curious to hear, what did that experience shape you, or how did that experience shape you?
Well, my life in Santa Fe, New Mexico, has been huge. I've been here 53 years. And when I first came, I had no idea that this was going to happen. Before I graduated from UC Berkeley, I had the good fortune to work with the poet Josephine Miles. And before I graduated, I told her I wanted to go somewhere in America I'd never been. I knew the East Coast a little bit, and I knew the Bay Area. And I knew I didn't want to go to graduate school. I wanted to, again, sort of live somewhere that was totally new. And she said, "Oh, why don't you try Santa Fe, New Mexico? It's really beautiful. And here are the names of two people I know there." So I really went there on a lark. And as I said, this was 1972. I hitchhiked into Santa Fe with my knapsack and my curiosity. And I called the two people that Josephine mentioned to me. And the second person, Stanley Noyes, said to me, "Oh, we're putting together a Poetry in the Schools project. If you're interested, you can put 10 poems together, submit them, a panel will review them, and if they like your work, they'll hire you and send you to schools around the state or different situations." And I had nothing waiting for me, so I applied and I was accepted. And then for the next 10 years, I worked in public junior high schools on Indian reservations, Spanish-speaking high schools. As you mentioned, I worked for the School for the Deaf with a sign translator. At one point, I worked at the state penitentiary. I even worked at one point through the bars of a cell with an inmate on death row. I worked all over the state in amazingly varied situations. And it was in America I didn't know existed. And it was really thrilling to come to Santa Fe. And I felt an immediate affinity with Native Americans. The two of the first people I met when I came to Santa Fe were a Navajo jeweler and a Pueblo photographer. And they introduced me to other Native peoples. And I just was really excited and exhilarated to be here. And one thing led to another. And then in 1983, I got a job teaching at the Institute of American Indian Arts. None of this was premeditated. And 5 years later, the dean made me the head of the creative writing program, and I was the only one left. And he said, "You now have carte blanche to hire all the faculty, rewrite the curriculum. You know the students. We want you to build the whole program." So I was actually there for 22 years, and I worked with Native students from over 200 tribes across the United States. In 2006, I became the first Poet Laureate of the city of Santa Fe. And it hadn't been done before, so I got to invent all sorts of interesting projects of holding poetry readings in the Palace of the Governors at a historic site where poets read poems based on sacred or important sites. I held a language forum at the Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian. So one thing has just kept leading to another, and at this point, I'm pretty rooted here.
Well, it sounds like all of the unexpected stepping stones led you to this moment. And we ended the last segment talking about how you found people looking for poetry in spaces that, and for people that you didn't expect to be looking for poetry. And as you work as an educator, and of course as Poet Laureate, outreaching and passing on poetry to the next generation of upcoming poets and readers, what does your approach look like? What's important for you to convey to our next generation of poets and readers?
Well, on a very simple level, that poetry is for everyone, that it communicates on a deep level, and it can be difficult, but it's not where one writes to be difficult. It's difficult because it's talking about deep places in life and in experience. And those are essential to how we live our lives, to leading full lives. So my hope is in using poetry in translation, I feel like that's a little less intimidating. If people show up and they're asked to translate a poem, they can do that. If they're asked to write the first poem in their life, there's a sense of terror there. And I don't want to heighten the sense of, oh my God, this is really difficult. But I think, as you mentioned, and I want to ask you a question in a minute, but for instance, the Chinese poems that I grew up were part of family, were part of culture. And it was not uncommon to hear a scientist quote a line from a famous poem. And that sense of poetry being in the air, being part of the tradition, I hope to make my small contribution with that. But could you talk a little bit about poetry and translation in your own background?
Well, I grew up I spent some time in Taiwan as an elementary school and middle school student. And you mentioned, I think you mentioned you translated 20 poems from the Tang Dynasty. Well, you've got about 280 more to go because the Tang Dynasty poems collection. There's 300 of them, so which is the poetry that young students in I think Asia kind of grow up in. And it's really hard to explain this part, so this is not going to be very helpful, but I've always found an affinity for Chinese poetry because there's something about the way the characters are written. And a lot of the Tang Dynasty poetry, they're structured in very specific characters and very specific lines. So they have a limited amount of space to express things. So they're not these epic poems. And it always amazes me how much history and storytelling and emotions that they can put behind, say, a line of 8 characters. I'm just making that up, but there's just something about the lyricism, the musicality, as you mentioned, that really strikes me as something that's really touching for me to read. And I'm so privileged to be able to still read them today. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I just want to add that for those who may not read Chinese characters, there's a kind of complexity and sophistication inside of each character that astonishes me. So when I would write out the poems, character by character, stroke by stroke, for instance, I like to point out that the character Autumn has a left and a right side, and the left side is plant or plant tips, vegetation, and the right side is fire. So in writing the character Autumn, what is really creating, when it's writing out an image of plant tips, of natural things on fire, and if you write below Autumn and put the character Heart or Mind, you're writing the word sorrow. So when you write the word sorrow in Chinese, you're actually creating a metaphor through juxtaposition. Sorrow is autumn in the heart, and you're literally writing that out. So the kind of depth and complexity in a Chinese character alone is so powerful. And when you see a poet start to use those and orchestrate them, even if it's 20 characters for a full poem, it's really astonishing and breathtaking.
Well, obviously, we'll have to have you come back and do a whole show just to talk about that because unfortunately, we're limited amount of time here. But just some final thoughts of any advice for listeners who may be intimidated by poetry. Got about 30 seconds.
Well, I hope you will take a look at Transient Worlds and make a translation. That oftentimes that's the first step to writing your own poems. It's a little easier is to look at someone else's poem and think, okay, I know Spanish, I know German, let me see how I can do this. Let me play with language. And then my sort of trick is to say, having made the translation, write the poem you could only have written after having made the translation.
Well, thank you so much. You've been listening to Arthur Sze, who is our U.S. Poet Laureate. Arthur, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your stories with us today.
Thank you for having me on your program.
And for our listeners, if you want more conversations on books and poetry, be sure to check out Where We Read by visiting ctpublic.org/where we read and sign up for our newsletter. And if you do make a translation, let us know because we would love to read it. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening and happy poetry reading and translating, everyone.